My name is Olivia Hartwell. I'm 34 years old. For most of my life, I believed that no matter how difficult family became, there were certain lines they would never cross. I was wrong. The moment I learned exactly how wrong I was happened the day I returned home after a 6-month work assignment overseas. The flight had been exhausting. All I could think about during the 14-hour journey was seeing my son again. Ethan was 3 years old. Every week while I was away, I had video called him. Every week I watched him smile, wave, show me drawings, tell me about cartoons. I counted the days until I could hold him again. But the second I unlocked my front door, something felt wrong. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No toys on the carpet. No little shoes by the entrance. No half-finished juice box sitting where it shouldn't be. The silence felt unnatural, like a stage after the actors had left. "Ethan?" I called. Nothing. I smiled nervously. Maybe Maria had taken him to the park. Maybe they were shopping. Maybe I was overreacting. But a strange feeling settled into my chest as I walked deeper into the house. I went straight to Ethan's bedroom. The bed was perfectly made. His favorite stuffed fox was missing. The rocket-shaped nightlight he'd slept with every night was gone. I opened his closet. My heart stopped. Most of his clothes had disappeared. His tiny sneakers, his books, his puzzles. Gone. I checked every drawer, every shelf, every corner. Nothing. I immediately grabbed my phone and called Maria. No answer. I called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. A message. No reply. A cold pressure tightened around my ribs. I hadn't even unpacked my suitcase. Within 15 minutes I was back in my car, and somehow, before I even reached the end of the street, I already knew where I was going. My mother's house. Because deep down, I already knew who was involved. The entire drive felt unreal. The closer I got, the faster my heart beat. When my mother opened the door, she wasn't surprised to see me. That frightened me more than anything. She simply stared at me. No smile, no welcome home, no explanation. Just a cold expression I had never seen before. "Where's Ethan?" I demanded. Her eyes didn't move. "He's with his real family now." For a second I thought I'd heard her wrong. "What?" But she had already stepped aside, almost inviting me inside, like she'd been expecting this moment. I walked past her, straight toward the kitchen, and that's where I found my younger sister, Madison. She sat at the table beside her husband, Connor. Stacks of paperwork were spread out in front of them. Legal forms, printed documents, folders. Then my eyes landed on a page near the top. My son's name, followed by a different surname. Madison's surname. I froze. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Madison looked up calmly. Far too calmly. As if we were discussing dinner plans. "I already started the process," she said. I stared at her. The room felt tilted. "What process?" She folded her hands. "The transition." The word hit me like a slap. She continued speaking, as though everything she was saying was perfectly reasonable. She told me she'd spoken with attorneys. She said she and Connor had been preparing for adoption for years. She said Ethan deserved stability, a complete family. Then she smiled. A tiny smile. The kind that made my stomach turn. "He calls me Mommy now." For a moment, my knees nearly gave out. Behind me, my mother crossed her arms. Like a guard, standing watch. Like she was protecting Madison from me. "You made your choice, Olivia," my mother said. I turned toward her. "What choice?" "You left. I left to work. You left your child." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Every dollar I earned had gone toward supporting Ethan. The house, the nanny, his future, everything. But somehow, they had twisted my sacrifice into abandonment. My mother kept talking, claiming Ethan was happier now, claiming Madison had become his real mother, claiming 6 months proved where my priorities were. Every sentence felt more insane than the last. Yet neither of them looked insane. That was the terrifying part. They looked convinced. As if they'd repeated this story so many times, they'd started believing it themselves. I looked around the room, at the documents, at Madison, at Connor, at my mother, and suddenly something clicked. This wasn't emotional. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. Carefully. Methodically. For months. Maybe longer. They hadn't stolen my son in a moment of desperation. They had built an entire strategy, and they expected me to surrender. They expected me to scream, cry, beg. Instead, I did none of those things. I turned around, walked out, got back into my car, and drove away. The rearview mirror blurred as tears finally threatened to appear, but I refused to let them fall, because somewhere beneath the shock, another feeling was growing. Rage. Not explosive rage. The dangerous kind. The cold kind. The kind that plans. I spent over an hour sitting alone in a parking lot, thinking, replaying every conversation, every video call, every message Maria had sent, every detail. By the time the sun began setting, I had reached one conclusion. They believed I was helpless. They were wrong. I had records. I had evidence. I had resources. And I had something even more important. The truth. That night, I checked into a hotel under a different name. I barely slept, not because I was crying, because I was working. By sunrise, every message between Maria and me had been backed up. Every payment record, every video, every photograph, every timestamp, every call log, everything. At 7:58 a.m., I called an attorney I trusted. I told him the entire story. For 10 minutes, he listened, without interrupting. When I finished, there was silence. Then he spoke 3 words. Parental rights violation. And in that moment, I knew this war had officially begun. The moment my attorney said those 3 words, something inside me settled. Not because I felt safe. Not because I thought winning would be easy. But because for the first time since returning home, I knew I wasn't imagining the horror of what had happened. Someone else saw it too. Someone else understood that my mother and sister hadn't simply overstepped boundaries. They had crossed into something much darker. We started immediately. My attorney warned me that time mattered. The longer Ethan remained with them, the more they could argue that he had established a routine, emotional bonds, stability. Courts cared about those things. And my mother and sister were counting on it. They thought 6 months was enough time to rewrite reality. They thought they could turn me into a distant memory. By the end of that first day, emergency custody paperwork had been filed. A petition demanding Ethan's immediate return. A formal complaint alleging unlawful detainment of a minor. The legal language sounded cold, clinical, but behind every page was a simple truth. My child had been taken from me. Then came the harder problem, finding Maria. For over a year she had cared for Ethan while I worked. She had attended birthday parties, doctor appointments, school orientation meetings. She knew how much I loved him, yet she had disappeared without a word. 3 days later, we found her. Nevada. The moment my attorney told me, I booked a flight. Not because I needed to confront her, because I needed answers. When we finally met, she looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. The moment she saw me, tears filled her eyes, and before I even spoke, she whispered 3 words. I'm so sorry. I sat across from her in a small conference room, my attorney beside me, a recorder running, and slowly, the entire story began to unfold. My mother had approached her shortly after I left. At first, it seemed innocent, just checking on Ethan, offering help, bringing groceries. Then things changed. My sister became involved. They started telling Maria strange things, that I was overwhelmed, that I regretted becoming a mother, that I was considering staying overseas permanently. Maria hadn't believed them. Not at first. Then the messages started arriving. Messages that appeared to come from me. The contact name was mine. The photo was mine. The wording even sounded like me. But it wasn't me. My mother and sister had used a burner phone, pretending to be me, creating conversations that never happened. Telling Maria I wanted Ethan spending more time with family. Telling her I needed space. Telling her I wasn't sure when I'd return. Maria admitted she became confused, then frightened, then manipulated. Eventually they offered her money. More money than I had ever paid her. A plan a ticket. A non-disclosure agreement Connor had drafted. Promises that everything was legal. That Ethan would be better off. That I was unstable. That she was helping. When she realized how serious things had become, guilt consumed her. She handed over her phone. Every message. Every screenshot. Every transfer record. My attorney practically smiled. For the first time since this nightmare began, we had proof. Real proof. Not suspicions. Evidence. Digital trails. Financial records. Fraud. Impersonation. The conspiracy was becoming visible, and it was far uglier than I'd imagined. The next step was filing for a temporary restraining order against both my mother and Madison. If approved, they would be legally prohibited from contacting Ethan, or approaching him, or attempting to influence him. But none of that mattered if we couldn't find where they were hiding him, because by then, they weren't keeping him at either house. I drove past my mother's place that evening. No toys, no stroller, no car seat, nothing. The lights were off before 8. The entire place felt abandoned, like a shell. That night, back at the hotel, I did something I never thought I'd do. I called my ex-husband, Nathan, Ethan's father. We hadn't spoken in years. Our divorce had been painful, complicated. He rarely contacted Ethan, rarely asked about him. Part of me hated making the call, but desperation leaves little room for pride. To my surprise, Nathan answered immediately. After hearing my story, he became very quiet. Then he laughed. Not because it was funny, because he was angry. Madison contacted me 2 weeks ago, he said. My stomach dropped. What? She wanted information about reinstating parental rights. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Nathan continued. Madison had told him I was unstable, that I planned to remain overseas, that Ethan needed a permanent home, that she and Connor were willing to provide one. The more Nathan talked, the clearer the picture became. They weren't improvising. They were building a case, creating witnesses, spreading a narrative, planting seeds, preparing for a future courtroom battle long before I knew one existed. Then Nathan said something that chilled me. I think I know where they took him. My grip tightened around the phone. A property outside city limits, owned by Connor's cousin. Remote, private, few neighbors, no questions, no atención. A perfect hiding place. I called my attorney immediately. It was nearly midnight. By morning, we had filed additional motions, and by afternoon, everything changed. The court approved the restraining order. Law enforcement received authorization to recover Ethan. I wasn't allowed to accompany them. That nearly destroyed me. I sat in my hotel room waiting. 1 hour, then 2, then 3. Every minute felt endless. I stared at my phone so long, my eyes hurt, imagining every possible outcome. Imagining Ethan scared, confused, asking for me, wondering why I never came. At exactly 6:41 p.m., my phone rang. I answered before the first ring finished. My attorney's voice sounded calm. We have him. The room spun. For several seconds I couldn't speak. My knees buckled, and I sat on the floor. Tears finally came. Real tears. The kind I'd been holding back for days. Is he okay? I whispered. He's safe. Safe. The word should have made everything better. But then my attorney hesitated. Just long enough for dread to return. Olivia. My heart sank. What? There was another pause. Then he answered. When officers found him, he asked for Madison. The words hit harder than anything else. Harder than the empty bedroom. Harder than the forged documents. Harder than the lies. Because in that moment, I realized what they had truly stolen. Not custody. Not paperwork. Not legal rights. They had stolen time. Memories. Trust. They had spent 6 months filling my son's mind with a different story. A different mother. A different life. And somehow, despite everything, the worst part was still waiting for me. The next morning I arrived at the Child Services Center, where Ethan was being temporarily held. A social worker escorted me into a small room. Plastic chairs. White walls. A cheap table. Nothing comforting. Nothing familiar. I sat there staring at the door, waiting, praying. Then it opened, and my son walked in. For one beautiful, terrible second, the entire world stopped. He looked bigger, older. His stuffed fox clutched tightly against his chest. I immediately opened my arms, expecting him to run toward me, expecting him to smile. Instead, he froze, standing in the doorway, looking at me with uncertainty, like he wasn't sure who I was, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to love me. My heart shattered. I forced a smile. Ethan. He nodded. Slowly, carefully. I crouched down. It's Mommy. He stared at me. 10 seconds. 20. 30. An eternity. Then he finally took one small step forward. And another. And another. 10 long minutes passed before he reached me. When I wrapped my arms around him, he didn't hug me back. He simply sat there, rigid, confused, silent. The social worker watched quietly, and when Ethan wasn't looking, she gently pulled me aside. They told him you left him. My chest tightened. They told him you didn't want to come back. I closed my eyes. The adjustment will take time, she continued softly. They told him someone else loved him more. I looked back at my son, at the fox in his hands, at the uncertainty in his eyes, and I realized something terrifying. Getting him back wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. I thought bringing Ethan home would be the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part was watching the confusion in his eyes every single day afterward. I didn't take him back to our old house. Too many memories. Too many vulnerabilities. Before leaving for Europe, I had never imagined I would need to protect my son from my own family. Now protection was all I thought about. Within days of regaining custody, I moved us into a different apartment across the city. A fresh start. Neutral ground. A place untouched by my mother and Madison. The first night Ethan barely spoke. The second night he asked when he was going back. The question nearly broke me. I kept my expression calm. Back where, sweetheart? Back to Aunt Madison's house. The words landed like knives. I smiled anyway. The way mothers do, when they're bleeding inside but refuse to let their children see it. Every day revealed another layer of damage. He asked if Grandma was angry at him. He asked if Aunt Madison missed him. He asked if he was in trouble. One night he woke up screaming. I rushed into his room. His entire body was shaking. He wrapped his tiny arms around my neck and cried. I don't want them to take me again. That sentence haunted me for weeks, because no 3-year-old should ever have that fear. No child should wonder who is allowed to keep them. No child should question who their mother is. Slowly, carefully, I began explaining things. Not the ugly legal details. Not the manipulation. Not the fraud. Just enough truth for a child to understand. I told him sometimes grown-ups make bad choices. Sometimes they tell stories that aren't true. Sometimes they want something so badly that they stop thinking about who gets hurt. But I never left you forever, I whispered one evening. I always came back. For the first time, Ethan looked directly into my eyes. Really looked. And something shifted. Not completely. Not magically. But enough. Enough for hope. While I focused on rebuilding my son's trust, my attorney continued preparing the case. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The evidence against my mother and sister was already overwhelming. Maria's testimony. The burner phone. Financial records. Forged communications. False representations. Everything pointed toward deliberate deception. Yet something continued bothering me. A feeling I couldn't explain. Every time I reviewed the timeline, something felt incomplete. They had executed this plan too perfectly, too smoothly, as if they had been rehearsing it long before I ever boarded that plane. One evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep clutching his stuffed fox, I opened my laptop and began searching. I started with Madison's social media. Nothing obvious appeared. No photos. No references. No mention of Ethan. She had been careful. Extremely careful. But people make mistakes. Eventually I found one. An old photograph someone had tagged her in. A backyard gathering. A month before I returned. Madison smiling beside Connor. Friends laughing. Children playing. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Then I noticed a familiar face in the background. Ethan, holding a balloon. Smiling. My son. At a party nobody had ever told me existed. My pulse quickened. I enlarged the image. Then, enlarged it again. And that's when I noticed something else. A small birthday cake sitting on a table. The cake had writing. A child's name. And beneath it, a surname. Not his surname. Madison's. For several seconds, I simply stared. They weren't planning to change his identity. They had already started. My hands began shaking. I traced the photo to Connor's cousin. Then, another account. Then another. The deeper I dug, the more evidence appeared. Photos. Comment? Videos. Posts they thought nobody would ever connect. There were dozens. Maybe hundreds. A complete alternate life they had been constructing around my son. A life where I didn't exist. A life where Madison was his mother. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the background of one photograph was someone I recognized immediately. My former boss, Richard Lawson. A man who had retired shortly before I accepted the European assignment. He wasn't related to Madison. Wasn't close family. Shouldn't have been there. Yet there he was. Smiling. Holding a drink. Looking completely comfortable. I called him the next morning. Pretending I simply wanted to catch up. We exchanged polite conversation. Then I casually mentioned the photo. There was a pause. A very long pause. Then Richard laughed warmly. I'm glad everything worked out. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? Another pause. Then he said words I will never forget. Your sister told us you wanted this. The room went silent. I gripped the phone tighter. Wanted what? The transition. The exact same word Madison had used. My chest felt hollow. Richard continued speaking, completely unaware of what he was revealing. Madison had told everyone I was permanently relocating overseas. That motherhood had become overwhelming. That I wanted Ethan raised by someone more stable. That I was slowly transferring parental responsibilities to her. A gradual transition. A compassionate transition. A responsible transition. Every lie sounded carefully rehearsed. Professional. Reasonable. Believable. The kind of lie people wanted to believe. I ended the call and sat motionless for nearly an hour. Then I started digging deeper. The discoveries became worse. Far worse. Former co-workers believed I had voluntarily surrendered custody. Family friends believed I was never returning. Church members believed I had abandoned my son. One woman had even sent me an email weeks earlier. At the time, it seemed harmless. A strange goodbye message. Now I understood what it really was. She thought she was saying farewell. Not because I was moving. Because she believed I was giving up my child. My mother and sister hadn't simply lied. They had launched a campaign. An organized effort. An entire alternate reality. Every person they spoke to received the same story. The same script. The same version of me. Career-driven. Detached. Emotionally. Unstable. Unfit. They weren't stealing custody. They were erasing motherhood itself. And for months, it had worked. The realization terrified me. Because if my flight home had been delayed, if my contract had been extended, if I had stayed overseas another month, Ethan might have accepted their version permanently. He might have forgotten who I really was. I printed everything. Every photograph. Every comment. Every message. Every timestamp. Every witness statement. My dining table disappeared beneath stacks of evidence. The pile kept growing. Then, 2 nights before the hearing, I made the discovery that changed everything. I was searching through an old email account I hadn't opened in years. One I barely remembered existed. Most of it was junk. Spam. Archived newsletters. Then a name caught my eye. Madison. I opened the message and instantly realized what I was looking at. An email chain. Years old. Forgotten. Hidden. Yet devastating. The messages were between Madison and a woman connected to private adoption consulting services. Not a government agency. Not an official program. One of those questionable consultants families sometimes used while exploring options. My heart pounded as I read. Then I saw the subject line. Plan B if Olivia says no. The email was dated 2 months before I accepted the assignment in Europe. 2 months. Before the opportunity even existed. Before anyone could claim concern. Before anyone could claim abandonment. Madison had already been searching for ways to acquire my son. The room suddenly felt smaller. Every explanation she'd given collapsed instantly. This wasn't a reaction. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't concern. It was premeditation. For months, possibly years, she had been waiting. Waiting for an opportunity. Waiting for a mistake. Waiting for an opening. And when Europe appeared, she took it. I printed every page, every attachment, every message. Then I placed them inside a separate folder. A folder I didn't even tell my attorney about yet. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something I had never seen before. A path to complete destruction. The court hearing was now only 48 hours away, and my mother and sister had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold. I barely slept the night before. Not because I was nervous, because I kept replaying every moment of the past 6 months. Every lie. Every manipulation. Every day my son had spent believing I abandoned him. Ethan was still asleep when I left the apartment. I stood beside his bed for several minutes before walking out, watching him hug that stuffed fox. watching him breathe peacefully, reminding myself why I was doing this. Not for revenge, not for pride, for him. By the time I entered the courthouse, my attorney was already waiting. He glanced at the thick binder in my arms and raised an eyebrow. "You found more?" I nodded. "A lot more." He smiled slightly. "Good." Neither of us knew just how much damage those documents would cause. When we entered the courtroom, my mother, Madison, and Connor were already seated. They looked confident, relaxed, almost cheerful. My mother wore the same pleasant smile she used at church events. Madison looked polished and composed. Connor sat beside her, like a man attending a business meeting. For a moment, I wondered if they genuinely believed they could still win. Then, the hearing began. The first hour focused on evidence already submitted. Maria's affidavit, the burner phone records, the fake messages, the unlawful custody arrangements. The judge listened carefully. The more evidence presented, the more uncomfortable Madison became. But she was still holding herself together, still believing she could explain everything away. Then my attorney introduced the financial records, and the atmosphere changed. Banktransfers, wire payments, transaction histories, all leading directly to Maria. Several payments had originated from Connor's account, months before Ethan disappeared, months before anyone claimed concern about his welfare. The judge reviewed the records carefully, then looked directly at Connor. "Did you pay the nanny?" Connor shifted in his chair. Madison glanced toward him. My mother stared at the table. For several seconds, nobody answered. Finally, Connor cleared his throat. "I don't recall the details." The judge's expression hardened. My attorney handed over additional records. Amounts, dates, transfer confirmation. Every payment clearly documented. The courtroom grew silent. Then came Maria's recorded statement. The video played on a large screen. Maria appeared nervous, exhausted, ashamed, but honest. She described everything: the lies, the manipulation, the promises, the money, the burner phone, the fake messages pretending to be me. Every word landed like a hammer. My mother stopped looking at the screen. Madison stared straight ahead. Connor's jaw tightened. The judge took notes without speaking. By the time the recording ended, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely changed. The confidence was gone. For the first time, they looked afraid. And I still hadn't revealed the most important evidence. My attorney sat beside me. "Anything else?" he whispered. I slowly opened the separate folder. His eyes widened. He began reading. Halfway through, he looked up at me, stunned. "Where did you find this?" "An old email account." For several moments, he simply stared. Then he stood. "Your Honor, we have additional evidence." The clerk accepted the documents. The judge began reading. The courtroom became so quiet that I could hear pages turning. Then came the email subject line. "Plan B, if Olivia says no." The judge read it aloud. Madison's face immediately lost color. My mother's eyes widened. Connor stopped breathing for a moment. The judge continued. Email after email. Message after message. Every one revealing the same truth. Madison had been exploring ways to obtain custody of Ethan long before my European assignment existed. Long before she claimed concern. Long before she accused me of abandonment. She had been planning, waiting, preparing. The illusion shattered instantly. No longer a worried aunt. No longer a concerned sister. A strategist. A planner. Someone searching for opportunities. My mother suddenly tried to interrupt. "That's being taken out of context." "Sit down," the judge said firmly. She sat. The silence afterward felt enormous. Madison looked completely defeated. For the first time since this nightmare began, she had nothing left to say. Nothing left to hide behind. No explanation capable of surviving the evidence. The judge closed the file, and within minutes, the decision was made. Full custody remained exclusively mine. The restraining order was extended. 5 years. No contact. No visits. No communication. No third-party messages. Nothing. Madison began crying. Connor attempted to speak. The judge stopped him immediately. My mother sat frozen, staring forward. The hearing ended shortly afterward. When I walked out of that courtroom, nobody followed me. Nobody apologized. Nobody called my name. They simply remained seated among the wreckage of their own choices. Most people would think that was the end. It wasn't. because the final folder in my binder had never been intended for court. The following morning, I mailed copies of several financial records to federal authorities. Anonymous. Simple. Documented. Accurate. The under-the-table payments weren't the only irregularities. There were unreported transfers, questionable business expenses, legal aliases used during custody-related filings. I didn't need revenge. The documents would speak for themselves. Then I focused on rebuilding our lives. Therapy for Ethan. Therapy for me. New routines. New traditions. Slowly, little by little, my son started coming back. The first time he reached for my hand without hesitation, I cried in the car afterward. The first time he called me mommy without uncertainty, I sat awake half the night smiling. The first time he laughed freely again, the apartment finally felt like home. Meanwhile, consequences began spreading through the lives of those who had tried to erase me. 2 weeks after the hearing, Madison lost her job. Her profession required public trust and ethical conduct. The investigation into her actions made continued employment impossible. Shortly afterward, my mother was quietly removed from a community board she had served on for years. People who once defended her now understood what had happened. One of her closest friends called me personally. She apologized, told me she believed my mother's story, told me she genuinely thought I had abandoned Ethan. Then she asked how he was doing. I answered honestly. Sometimes he still wakes up afraid someone will take him. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. No defense, no excuse, just silence. By midsummer, Connor's business was under review. Audits began. Financial questions emerged. Their house eventually went on the market. I never celebrated any of it. There was no victory in watching people destroy themselves. Only consequences. Natural consequences. The kind that arrive when lies finally run out of places to hide. Several months later, Ethan and I moved to another state. A completely fresh beginning. New schools. New neighbors. New memories. I filed extensive protections around his records. School. Medical information. Addresses. Everything required court authorization. No loopholes. No access. No surprises. Bulletproof. And for the first time in years, I stopped looking over my shoulder. The strangest part wasn't the anger. Eventually that faded. The sadness faded too. What remained was clarity. For years, I convinced myself my family was merely difficult, overbearing, controlling, complicated. I told myself they meant well, that deep down they loved me. The truth was far more dangerous. They didn't want to help me. They wanted ownership. They wanted control. They wanted dependency. And when I built a life that didn't require them, they tried to take the one thing they believed would force me back. My son. But they failed. Because they underestimated one thing. A mother who refuses to disappear. Sometimes I sit beside Ethan while he draws rockets and dragons across sheets of paper. Sometimes I watch him sleep with that old stuffed fox tucked beneath his arm. And every time I do, I think about how close they came. One more month overseas. One more delayed flight. One more extension on my contract. And they might have succeeded. They might have erased me from my own child's memory. But they didn't. They thought they could rewrite the story. They thought they could decide who belonged in my son's life. They thought they were holding the pen. They were wrong. I'm the one holding it now.